Breaking the chains. Part 1. The Golden Cage. The Whitmore name was like a golden ticket in Boston. It opened doors, quieted rooms, and made people stand a little straighter. Unfortunately for me, Ethan Whitmore, it was also a burden heavier than the marble columns that held up our Beacon Hill mansion. "You're late," my father announced without looking up from the Wall Street Journal when I entered the dining room. Harrison Whitmore didn't need to check his watch. His disapproval operated on atomic precision. "Board meeting ran long," I replied, sliding into my chair as Maria, our housekeeper of 20 years, discreetly placed a plate before me. I smiled at her. Father never did. "Which charity this time?" Bradley smirked from across the table. My older brother had our father's steel-gray eyes and shark-like business instincts. "Save the puppies. Feed the artists. Clean water initiatives in developing countries," I corrected, cutting into my now-cold steak. "And it's not charity, it's investment in sustainable infrastructure." Father folded his newspaper with a crisp snap. "Investments generate returns, Ethan. What you do is hand out money while tarnishing our reputation with these bleeding heart ventures." My mother, Margaret, elegant in pearls even at the breakfast table, touched his arm. "Harrison, please. It's Sunday." "Every day is a business day," Father replied, his mantra since I could remember. "Bradley secured the Hartman merger yesterday. $200 million in new assets under management." He looked at me. "What have you contributed lately?" I'd learned long ago that my achievements, graduating summa cum laude from Harvard, my patents, my work, meant nothing in this house unless they added zeros to the Whitmore Capital balance sheet. "Actually," I said, "I've been working on something new. A platform that—" "Not another one of your ethical technology schemes," Bradley interrupted. "Father, he's becoming embarrassing. The Prescotts asked if Ethan was adopted at the club last week." I gripped my fork tighter. My last scheme returned 18% while creating jobs in 3 states. "Pennies," Father dismissed. "And you refused to cut those union jobs when I advised it." "Because people's livelihoods matter more than an extra 2% margin." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Father dabbed his mouth with a napkin, stood, and reached into his jacket. He tossed an envelope onto my plate. "Your last stipend," he announced. "It's time you learned what real work is. You have until the end of the month to vacate your office at Whitmore Tower and your apartment on Commonwealth Avenue." Mother gasped. "Harrison." "It's for his own good, Margaret," Father said. 30 years I've built this family's legacy, and I won't have him squandering it on idealism." I opened the envelope, a check for $25,000. My severance from my own family. "Fine," I said, folding the check and standing. "But you should know your legacy isn't what you think it is." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Bradley demanded. I smiled for the first time that morning. "You'll see." Later that day, I sat on a bench in Boston Common, watching ducks paddle across the pond while I called the one person who'd understand. "He actually cut you off." Sophie Lynn's voice was equal parts outrage and calculation. We'd been friends since freshman year at Harvard, where she'd been the brilliant scholarship kid from Queens who taught me how the other 99% lived. "Clean break," I confirmed. "The Whitmore name without the Whitmore money." "So what's the plan?" Sophie asked. I could hear her typing furiously, probably already running numbers. "Remember that algorithm we developed? The one that flags suspicious financial activity? The one your father called regulatory overreach nonsense?" "Yeah. I think it's time we put it to use." I watched a child throw bread to the eager ducks. 3 years I've been collecting data on Whitmore Capital's operations. Dad and Bradley think they've covered their tracks, but— "You found something," Sophie finished. "Something big. Big enough to bring down an empire." I took a deep breath. "But I need to build something first, something bigger and better than anything they've seen." Sophie's laughter bubbled through the phone. "Ethan Whitmore, you magnificent bastard. I'm in. Meet me at my place in an hour. And bring that check. We're going to need startup capital." As I walked toward the T-station, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "I'm sorry. Please be careful. Too late for careful, I thought. The game was already in motion. Part 2. The Rise. 6 months can change everything. I learned that lesson while standing in the gleaming lobby of Lynn Whitmore Technologies, watching our logo, a stylized bridge spanning a chasm, rotate on the digital wall display. Mr. Whitmore, our receptionist, Delia, approached with a tablet. The investors from Sequoia are here early. Ms. Lynn asked me to find you. Thanks, Delia. I straightened my tie, not the Hermes that my father preferred, but a bright blue one Sophie had given me when we signed our first client. Our office occupied the 15th floor of a renovated factory building in Cambridge's Kendall Square, tech central for Boston and a deliberate world away from the financial district where Whitmore Tower cast its shadow. The exposed brick walls and open floor plan would have given my father hives. I found Sophie in our conference room, already charming the venture capital representatives with her rapid-fire delivery and unmatched command of our financials. "And here's the man himself," she said, waving me in. "Ethan Whitmore, the coding genius behind our proprietary algorithm." "Just half the genius," I corrected, shaking hands around the table. Without Sophie's financial expertise, I just have elegant code with nowhere to go. 2 hours later, we had secured an additional $10 million in Series B funding. Our platform, officially called Financial Integrity Network, though we affectionately called it FIN, had gone from concept to reality faster than either of us had imagined. What had begun as my personal vendetta had evolved into something genuinely revolutionary. A system that could identify potentially unethical financial maneuvers with unprecedented accuracy. That puts us at $28 million in total investment, Sophie calculated as we celebrated with takeout ramen at her desk that evening. Not bad for the useless son and the scholarship kid. I laughed, though there was still a sting in the truth. We're just getting started. FIN's real test is coming. Your father still doesn't know you're behind this, does he? I shook my head. The Lynn Whitmore name was deliberate misdirection. He assumes I'm off licking my wound somewhere, probably using up that last check. Which instead became our first server farm, Sophie said with a grin. Poetic. My phone buzzed with a news alert. I opened it to find Bradley's smug face staring back at me from the Boston Globe's business section. Whitmore Capital announces historic expansion. Speaking of your family, Sophie peered over my shoulder, looks like Big Brother is making moves. I scanned the article. Whitmore Capital was acquiring 3 smaller firms, leveraging an impressive influx of foreign capital that had raised eyebrows in financial circles. That doesn't make sense, I murmured. Where did they get that kind of liquidity? When I left, they were actually struggling with cash flow despite what they projected to the public. Want to run it through FIN? Sophie suggested, already typing. That night became the first of many late ones as we directed our algorithm to examine every public record of Whitmore Capital's recent activities. What we found was troubling, a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and transactions that skated the edge of legality. They're laundering money, I concluded one night, 3 weeks and countless coffee cups later. And not just any money, they're helping clean funds for the Carlton Group. Sophie whistled low. The real estate developers being investigated by the SEC for fraud? That's playing with fire. That's my father, I replied grimly. High risk, high reward. He always said the laws were written by people too afraid to be great. Our investigation continued in parallel with growing our company. Every day, more financial institutions signed on to use our platform for compliance and risk assessment. By month 3, we had 30 employees. By month 6, we had 100, a wait list of clients, and a valuation that had Sophie doing victory dances around the office. What we also had was evidence, meticulously documented and cross-referenced proof of my family's financial crimes. What now? Sophie asked as we reviewed the final analysis. Go to the SEC. The FBI. I leaned back in my chair, thinking of the text my mother had sent the night I left. She still checked in occasionally, though she never mentioned my father or Bradley. Her last message had been about an upcoming charity gala, the annual Whitmore Foundation event at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, where Boston's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their philanthropy. Not yet, I decided. Justice served cold is still justice, but I want them to know exactly who served it." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You have that look. The one that scares me and impresses me at the same time." I pulled up the Whitmore Foundation website. "How do you feel about making an anonymous donation to a charity gala?" "How anonymous? And how large?" I smiled. "Large enough to become the primary sponsor. Anonymous enough that they won't know until the night of the event." The plan crystallized as I spoke. "We'll need their guest list, seating chart, and a friendly reporter or two." "Ethan," Sophie's voice grew serious, "this isn't just business anymore. This is personal." "It's always been personal," I admitted. "But now it's also justice. They've built their empire on exploitation. It's time someone held them accountable." The next morning, I found a plain white envelope on my desk. Inside was an invitation to the Whitmore Foundation Gala, with a handwritten note, "I miss you, Mom." Sophie found me staring at it. "Universe sending you a sign?" "More like the final piece of the puzzle," I replied, tucking the invitation into my jacket pocket. "It's time to RSVP." Part 3. The Reckoning. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts transformed for a night into what my father would call a proper showing of Boston society. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over marble floors where women in designer gowns and men in bespoke tuxedos mingled beneath priceless art. The irony wasn't lost on me. Wealth admiring wealth. I stood in the shadows of the grand staircase, watching. Bradley worked the room like he owned it, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. My father held court near the bar, surrounded by the city's power players. And my mother, elegant in midnight blue, smiled her perfect hostess smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Stop fidgeting," Sophie whispered beside me. In a red gown that probably cost a month of our office rent, she looked like she belonged here, except for the mischievous glint in her eyes that matched my own. "You're about to bring down an empire. Act like it." "I'm not nervous," I replied, adjusting my cufflinks. My grandfather's, the only Whitmore heirloom I'd taken when I left. "I'm savoring the moment." At precisely 8 o'clock, the museum director tapped a microphone at the front of the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala." Polite applause followed. As you know, this event raises crucial funds for Boston's educational initiatives. This year, however, we have an unprecedented development. My father frowned slightly. Deviations from the script weren't part of his carefully choreographed events. For the first time in the gala's history, we have received an anonymous donation that has doubled our fundraising goal before the evening even began. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The donor has requested to remain anonymous until this moment, but has asked to say a few words. I stepped forward from the shadows, and the room fell silent. I could pinpoint the exact second my father recognized me. His ever-present mask of confidence slipped for just a heartbeat. "Good evening," I began, approaching the microphone. "For those who don't know me, I'm Ethan Whitmore." The whispers began immediately. I caught fragments. "The younger son. Hasn't been seen in months. Some kind of falling out. I'm honored to support Boston's educational future," I continued. "Especially since education is what brings me here tonight, not just to donate, but to educate all of you about the true nature of the Whitmore legacy." Bradley started moving toward me, but my father placed a restraining hand on his arm, eyes narrowed as he calculated his next move. "The Whitmore name has long stood for financial excellence and philanthropy," I said, gesturing around the opulent room. "At least, that's the story. But every fortune has its foundations, and tonight I'd like to shed some light on ours." With perfect timing, the screens around the room, meant for displaying auction items, lit up with graphs, transaction records, and financial flows. Sophie's work, activated by her tablet as she stood unobtrusively by a Roman sculpture. "What you're seeing is evidence of systematic money laundering operations conducted through Whitmore Capital over the past 5 years, I explained, my voice steady. "Particularly focusing on recent transactions with the Carlton Group, currently under federal investigation." The room erupted. I spotted 2 journalists I recognized furiously taking notes, exactly as planned. Bradley lunged forward, but 2 museum security guards, whom we'd briefed earlier, stepped between us. "This is slander," my father thundered, finding his voice. My son is disturbed, clearly suffering some kind of breakdown. Actually, came a new voice, these allegations appear quite substantiated. A tall woman in a conservative suit stepped forward from near the bar. I recognized her instantly, Helena Rivera, the newly appointed head of the SEC's Enforcement Division. Ms. Rivera, my father said, his voice suddenly accommodating, this is hardly the venue. When my office received an anonymous tip last week, I was skeptical, she continued as if he hadn't spoken. But the evidence was compelling enough that I decided to see for myself. I didn't expect such a dramatic confirmation. She nodded to two men near the entrance, who moved forward with the unmistakable purpose of federal agents. Harrison Whitmore, Bradley Whitmore, Rivera announced. I'd like to speak with you both. Immediately. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. My father's face had gone from red to ashen. Bradley looked desperately for an escape route. I stepped closer to them, lowering my voice so only our family could hear. You taught me that power is everything, Father. But real power is earned, not inherited. And it certainly isn't stolen. You ungrateful, Bradley began, but Father silenced him with a look. You've destroyed everything I built, my father said, each word precise and cold. No, I corrected him. You destroyed it yourself. I just refused to help you bury the evidence. As the agents led them toward a side room for preliminary questioning, I turned to my mother, who stood frozen in place, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. Mom, I said gently, extending my hand. You don't have to go down with them. There's a place for you, if you want it. Her eyes, so like mine, darted from my father's retreating back to my outstretched hand. For a terrible moment, I thought 30 years of compromise would win out. Then she set down her glass, squared her shoulders, and stepped toward me. The applause started somewhere near the back of the room, perhaps from someone who thought this was all part of the evening's entertainment. It spread until the marble halls echoed with it, a standing ovation for a drama no one had expected but everyone would remember. Sophie appeared at my elbow. Not exactly subtle, she murmured, but effective. Subtle wasn't the goal, I replied as I escorted my mother through the crowd. Faces that had ignored me for months now smiled eagerly, attempting to align themselves with whichever Whitmore remained standing. Outside on the museum steps, away from the chaos, my mother turned to me. I should have left years ago, she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in decades. It's never too late to start over, I told her. As the first news vans pulled up to the curb, right on schedule, Sophie joined us, looking out at the Boston skyline where Whitmore Tower stood illuminated against the night. Now, she said with that characteristic smirk that had gotten us through countless late nights and impossible problems, let's build something even bigger. And for the first time in months, I felt free of the weight I'd carried, not just of revenge, but of becoming what my father had always wanted. Something better awaited, something built on integrity rather than intimidation. The real legacy was just beginning. Part 4. The Aftermath. 6 months after what the Boston Globe dubbed the Whitmore revelation, I found myself back in a courtroom, this time as a witness rather than a defendant. The federal case against Whitmore Capital had expanded beyond even what Sophie and I had uncovered, revealing a decades-long pattern of financial manipulation that had touched nearly every major business in Boston. Mr. Whitmore, the prosecutor said, can you describe when you first became aware of the illegal activities at your family's company? I glanced across the courtroom where my father sat beside his attorney, his once commanding presence diminished by an orange jumpsuit and the weight of pending charges. Bradley had already accepted a plea deal, turning on father in exchange for a reduced sentence. The Whitmore men had always been practical above all else. 3 years ago, I testified, I discovered discrepancies in our Caribbean holdings while reviewing quarterly reports. When I brought them to my father's attention, he told me some regulations were mere suggestions for those smart enough to work around them. The jury, a mix of working-class Bostonians who had little sympathy for financial crimes, scribbled notes. My father's face remained impassive, but I knew him well enough to see the calculation behind his eyes. Even now, he was looking for leverage, for escape. Afterward, as I descended the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed with questions about betraying my family. I didn't betray my family, I told them. I honored what my family should have stood for, integrity, responsibility, and the understanding that wealth brings obligation, not exemption from rules. Sophie waited in our company car, a sensible electric sedan rather than the Bentley my father had driven. "How'd it go?" she asked as I slid in beside her. "About as expected. Father still thinks he'll beat this somehow." "He won't," Sophie said with certainty. "The evidence is too strong, and too many of his former allies are testifying against him to save themselves." We drove through Boston's financial district, past Whitmore Tower, now bearing a "for sale" sign after the bankruptcy proceedings. The empire had crumbled with remarkable speed once the first dominoes fell. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" Sophie asked quietly. "I mean, he is still your father." I considered the question seriously, as I had every day since the gala. "I'm at peace with it," I finally answered. "What I'm not at peace with is how many people were hurt along the way." That was the truth that had emerged in the aftermath. The pension funds damaged by my father's schemes, the small businesses crushed when his leveraged deals collapsed, the employees who lost everything while the Whitmores had prospered. My victory had uncovered their losses. Which was why we'd changed direction at Lynn Whitmore Technologies. Our algorithm now had a new purpose: identifying victims of financial crimes and helping them recover damages. We'd established a foundation using my portion of the recovered Whitmore assets, dedicated to financial education and regulatory reform. "How's your mother doing?" Sophie asked as we pulled up to our office. "Better every day," I said. "The therapy is helping." 30 years married to my father left deeper scars than even she realized. Mother had moved into a small but elegant brownstone in Back Bay, volunteering at an art museum and slowly rebuilding a life beyond my father's shadow. We had dinner together every Sunday, a tradition we'd both insisted on keeping, though with very different energy than the stilted meals of my childhood. Our office hummed with activity as we entered, over 200 employees now, with a waiting list of financial institutions eager to implement our compliance systems. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had dismissed my ethical technology schemes, and now those same ideas were rebuilding what his crimes had tarnished. "Mr. Whitmore," my assistant called as we passed, "Senator Warren's office called again about your testimony next week on financial regulation reform." "Tell them I'll be there," I replied. "And send them the latest draft of our proposal." In my office, I found a small package waiting on my desk. No return address, but the handwriting was instantly recognizable. My father's precise, commanding script. Inside was a single item, his prized fountain pen, the one he'd used to sign every major deal of his career. A note accompanied it: "You won, Ethan. Use power wisely. It corrupts more subtly than you think. H.W. A peace offering?" Sophie asked, reading over my shoulder. "A warning," I corrected, setting the pen aside. "And possibly the first honest advice he's ever given me." Later that afternoon, I visited the community center in Dorchester where Lynn Whitmore sponsored coding classes for underprivileged students. As I watched teenagers excitedly debug their first programs, I thought about legacy, what my father had built and what I was trying to create in its place. "Mr. Whitmore," a girl of about 16 approached, tablet in hand. "I built something I'd like to show you." She demonstrated a simple app that helped users track expenses and understand basic financial concepts. Exactly the kind of financial literacy tool that might have helped some of my father's victims. "This is impressive," I told her sincerely. "What inspired you?" "My mom lost her savings in some investment scheme last year," she explained. "I figured if more people understood how money really works, fewer people would get hurt." In that moment, I saw more clearly than ever the difference between my father's philosophy and my own. He believed power came from controlling others through money. But real power, lasting, meaningful power, came from empowering others. That evening, as Sophie and I shared takeout in my new apartment, modest by Whitmore standards but with a view of the Charles River that still took my breath away, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Dinner was lovely. Proud of you, always." "You know," Sophie said, gesturing with her chopsticks, "when we started this, it was about revenge. Now it's become something bigger." I thought about the girl at the community center, about my mother's newfound independence, about the financial system we were slowly helping to reform. "That's the thing about legacy," I replied, watching the sunset paint the river gold. "If you build it right, It outlasts even your own reasons for building it. The darkness my father had cultivated had been exposed, but from it had grown something unexpected, a chance to create light instead. Not the blinding spotlight of wealth and power that the Whitmore name had once commanded, but something warmer and more enduring, the steady illumination of lives improved, systems reformed, and wrongs made right. It wasn't the legacy my father had planned for me. It was better.